Narratives of history can be very strange. For example, students of history will realize that every country or community explains its history through a variety of biased or partial views. The student of history will find that if he or she is studying a war between country or community A versus country or community B, then the historians of each country would portray their kings or leaders and their people as virtuous, noble, moral, and brave, whilst the kings or leaders and the people of the other side would be villainous, immoral, and treacherous. This perspective of the past would be fine, so long as we do not wish to learn the histories of other countries and other communities. In this series, The History of the Muslims of Sri Lanka, we are now beginning to describe the colonial era. There have been the colonizers, consisting of a few European countries, and the colonized, consisting of many countries across the continents. Now, some of the words used by countries to describe their experience of coming under colonial rule would be domination, exploitation, genocide, oppression, subjugation, enslavement, and as you can well imagine, there are many more such descriptive words. The colonialists are portrayed as being villainous, avaricious, and ruthless. In entering the era of colonialism, which obviously has perspectives that point fingers, we are getting into tough territory. But when we look at it in terms of winds of change, then we begin to understand the forces that contributed to it. What were the forces that brought about amongst the colonizing countries this spirit or need to explore the seas, seek out other countries, and then dominate and conquer? Why did colonialism emerge from Europe? On what grounds of morality did they justify these actions to themselves? There are many reasons. Let me describe just 3 of them. Reason number 1, the harsh winters of Europe. Sri Lanka is a tropical island. There is warmth, sunshine, and rain all year round. It is green, fertile, and there is always a variety of plentiful crops. By 1500 AD, there were literally thousands of wavers that stored water to be used even in the dry or rainless months. Europe, by contrast, had harsh winters, where for many months of the year, no crops would thrive and the country would be covered in snow. The grim scarcity of food and the hunger of one's family eventually becomes an enormous force that feeds the mindset of might being right. Reason number 2, the wealth of the colonized lands. Before the Europeans embarked on colonizing lands, food and other merchandise reached Europe through the Silk Route, a network of trade routes that worked itself through many lands before finally reaching Europe. As you can well imagine, the journey was long, the merchandise would have been handled by many middlemen, and the prices would thus have been exorbitant. The Europeans wanted to get to the source of all this merchandise and claim the wealth, and so they used their bold and adventurous men to discover a roundabout route by sailing the seas. Pope Alexander VI, fearing friction between the 2 initial colonizing countries at that time, Spain and Portugal, drew a line on the globe, the line of demarcation, and ordered that lands on the west of this line belong to Spain for colonizing, and that lands on the east of this line belong to Portugal. This is how attempts were made until in 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama and his ships discovered what they called the Cape of Good Hope. They found that in the name of religion, they could go to faraway lands that were fertile and not just trade for the crops, but claim the land itself as sovereignty of their kingdom. Reason number 3. The Crusades and the morality of God's backing. The spirit of the Crusades no doubt fed the colonialists' drive. The BBC video documentary titled Holy Land by Dr. Thomas Asbridge describes it thus. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon that would transform the history of Europe. His rousing words transfixed the people, and in the months that followed, his message reverberated across the West. The age of the Crusades had begun. The Pope proclaimed a new holy war against Islam for control of the most hallowed site in the Christian cosmos, the city of Jerusalem, which lay in the hands of Islam. But the Pope had a problem. Jerusalem had fallen to Islam more than 400 years earlier, so he could hardly claim this as a fresh crime by the Muslims. His graphic imagery of the Muslims bore little resemblance to the reality of Islamic rule in the Holy Land. To lend urgency to his call, Urban therefore turned to one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in human history, the idea of otherness, of an alien enemy guilty of ghastly crimes who must be repelled. This jaundiced view of Islam was to do much damage. As Europe became globally dominant after the Renaissance and Industrial Revolution, their deep-seated hostility towards Muslims was spread the world over. Thus, a European prejudice became a world prejudice, and it became a tremendous task for an inquiring mind to approach Islam without an aversion. The idea of the crusade was unleashed in a spiritual age. Today, we might be acculturated to notions of tolerance, skepticism, and religious difference, but a singular truth bound together almost every human being alive in the 11th century Europe, and that was unconditional and total belief in Christianity. The Pope knew well the anxiety of Christian warriors filled with violence yet taught by the Church that bloodshed was sinful. The real genius of his crusading ideal was that it solved this dilemma, reconciling faith and violence. Urban spoke of a new sacred struggle in which fighting would not simply be permitted but actively encouraged and even rewarded, much like what today's jihadists claim. So the harsh winters of Europe, the wealth of the colonized lands, as well as the Crusades and the morality of God's backing were three of the forces that fueled colonialism. Now we move on to describing colonialism in relation to Sri Lanka and her Muslims. The purpose of this episode is to examine how the policies of the Portuguese threw the Muslims and the Sinhalese together against a common enemy, thus strengthening an already existing relationship of mutual interdependence and thereby accelerating the process of Sri Lankanization of the Muslims. The colonization of Sri Lanka began with the Portuguese in 1505 and ended with the departure of the British in 1948. During this period of 443 years, Sri Lanka has partially been under the rule of the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British until 1815, when the British took control of the entire island. The Portuguese regarded the Arabs as their foes in faith and as their rivals in the lucrative trade of the Indian Ocean. With astonishing speed and complete ruthlessness, the Portuguese forcefully broke down the trade that had peacefully developed by the Muslims, who were the undisputed masters of the Indian Ocean trade. The Indo-Sri Lankan trade was in their hands, and it was they who connected the Arab world, the Middle East, and the Far East to this island country of ours. When the famous Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited Sri Lanka, the island was fabled for its wealth. It was a hub of international trade in the Indian Ocean, welcoming foreign traders and travelers with open arms. It was a rich mosaic of ethnicities and a picture of religious and ethnic harmony. In Colombo, or Kalambuas as Battuta called the town, the ruler was a Muslim called Jalasti. Being a seaport and a trading town, Colombo was chiefly composed of non-Sinhalese and foreigners. When the Portuguese arrived in 1505, the first thing they saw was a minaret and thought Lanka was an Islamic country. Thatched roofs slanting low towards the sea so as to resist the fierce attack of the southwest monsoon protected the mud-built houses which formed the main street, which connected Colombo with the northern part of Modara. Prominent among them rose the white walls of two mosques standing out clear from the background of green. Muslim dominance in trade meant a free and healthy competition of many nationalities of Muslims such as Arabs, Persians, Gujaratis, Bengalis, Malays, etc., as well as the Hindus and the Chinese. European dominance really meant operations being directed by a single central power backed by armed force, which was meant to deprive every other competitor of any share in the trade of the region. The Portuguese were the first nation to introduce armed conflict into oceanic trade, deprive their rivals, and establish an oceanic empire for themselves. The Portuguese ordered the expulsion of the Muslims from Sri Lanka, and by a decree of Azevedo, a viceroy between 1612 to 1617, no Moor was allowed to reside in Colombo, and then followed a royal decree from Portugal by which the king ordered a total prohibition of the Moors being admitted to the island. Dr. T.B.H. Abe Singha, quoting from Portuguese archival sources, lays bare the degrees by which the Muslims of this country were subject to untold sufferings, and how, with the goodwill of the Sinhala populace and the kings, they were able to carry on their peaceful and economic activities by which they endeared themselves to the natives of the island. Their advent had been welcomed with that liberality which always characterized the conduct of the Sinhalese towards strangers, so long as they did not prove themselves unworthy of a welcome. They had been allowed to establish a factory of their own for the convenience of trade, the site of which is no doubt marked today by the ancient Hamban Kotua in the Peta, and their relations with the Sinhalese were of the most amiable description. When the Portuguese tried to gain a foothold in Colombo, the Muslims provided firearms, fought side by side with the Sinhalese, and even used their influence with South Indian powers to get military assistance to the Sinhalese rulers in their efforts to oust the intruder. Learn all about this and more in our coming episodes.